of all, some housekeeping business. There are bathrooms over there, and there's a bathroom at the exit. We have a terrific program ahead of us tonight. We're going to be talking about the Palestinian right of return. And this is a subject that is not much understood in mainstream circles. After our speakers, we're going to have an open Q&A and discussion period. You do not have to ask a question. You're free to make a statement or say whatever you like, as long as you keep it short. And now I want to turn the meeting over to our moderator, Riham Barghouti, who's a Palestinian American activist who lived in the occupied Palestinian territories for 10 years. She currently resides in New York City, where she works as a teacher. Riham is a founding member of Adalah-NY, the New York campaign for the boycott of Israel, and of PACB, the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. Riham.
I'm really honored to be sitting among these three individuals who I consider very good friends, but more importantly, who have such a deep and unwavering commitment to social justice. Jamil Dakwar, Donna, Nevel, and Bina Ahmad. So we're here tonight to explore what is arguably the most contentious, but undeniably the most significant aspect of the Palestinian struggle for liberation and self-determination. The right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and lands in historic Palestine. In 1948, over 750,000 out of the 1.4 million Palestinians that were living in 1,300 towns and villages were driven out of their homeland in what is present-day Israel to the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, neighboring Arab countries, and the remaining countries of the world. That constituted 80% of the indigenous population of Palestine. Palestinian Muslims and Christians that were forcibly expelled from their homes. Their lands were confiscated, their homes and their villages were destroyed in order to establish a Jewish majority state in their ancestral homeland. In addition, thousands of Palestinians were displaced from their homes, but they stayed within the newly declared state of Israel. And according to documented data, Israel controlled some 774 towns and villages and had destroyed 531 Palestinian towns and villages. The atrocities of the Israeli forces also included more than 70 massacres during this period, in which 15,000 Palestinians were killed. This is why Palestinians call this Nakba, the catastrophe. This year, 2018, as Israel celebrates its 70th anniversary, Palestinians mark the 70 years of a Nakba that began in 1948 but continues today. Currently, more than half of the Palestinian people live as refugees. They number about 7 million of 13 million Palestinians worldwide. And they still hold on to their keys of their homes and refuse, even now, 70 years later, to leave those refugee camps because they are determined to return. The right of refugees to return to their homes is an inalienable right. It's a universal right. It's a right that cannot be negotiated away or done away with for pragmatic reasons. And it is also what is just, and it's a basic prerequisite for Palestinians to find freedom, justice, and equality. So our three speakers tonight will further explore this topic of Palestinian refugees' right to their return to their homes. And I'm honored to present them now. Jamil Dakwar is the director of the American Civil Liberties Union Human Rights Program. He worked at Human Rights Watch, where he conducted research, engaged in advocacy, and published reports on issues of torture and detention in Egypt, Morocco, Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territory. He was also a senior attorney with Adalah, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel, where he filed and argued human rights cases before Israeli courts and advocated before international forums. He's a graduate of Tel Aviv University and New York University School of Law, and an adjunct professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Hunter College, CUNY. And he'll be speaking in his personal capacity, not as an ACLU staff member. Donna Nevel is a community psychologist and educator, is a co-director of Parcio, a participatory action research center. She's the founding member of the Facing the Nakba project, Jews Say No, and Jews Against Anti-Muslim Racism. She was a co-founder of Jews for Racial and Economic Justice and the Center for Immigrant Families. And Bina Ahmad is a social justice attorney who has worked with numerous animal rights and human rights organizations. She worked and lived in Palestine. She worked in Al-Haq, where she served on the legal team for the Russell Tribunal in Palestine. She was a legal consultant to Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights, as well as the Norwegian Refugee Council's Palestine Division. She currently serves on the steering committee of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, as well as the advisory board of the Food Empowerment Project and the advisory board of the Animal Rights Activism Committee, an activist group of lawyers and legal workers she co-founded. She conducts Know Your Rights trainings, of which I attended and are excellent, for radical left movements and state-targeted communities. And she currently works as a public defender in New York. Please welcome our speakers for this evening.
Thank you very much, Riham, for the very kind introduction and for your activism and dedication to Palestinian rights issues while working as a dedicated teacher. I know that many of you have the same responsibilities and commitments, and we really appreciate you all coming tonight to talk about this very important issue. And I'm also honored to share the panel with Bina and Donna. In fact, I met Donna first time when we shared a panel on the Goldstone report years ago, and we became very close friends since then. And Bina through her work, both here and when she was in Palestine and during a very tough time. So I'm really honored to be here and to talk to you about this issue. As Riham mentioned, I'm a Palestinian myself, and I now live in New York, and I was born and raised in Haifa. So I'm one of those Palestinians who their parents or families were lucky enough, fortunate enough to survive the 1948 Nakba and the war and stayed inside Palestine. And one of the 175,000 Palestinians who became formal citizens of Israel, and now number around 1.4 or 1.5 million people. So I will be also speaking from that perspective, maybe in the Q&A. I was asked to speak specifically about the legal rights of refugees, particularly under international law, and as well as connecting it to what's happening now in Gaza, particularly around the Great March of Return, which I'm sure all of you have been following with deep sorrow for the fact that how this movement, the largely peaceful movement of people really seeking return, is being crushed by deadly force on a weekly basis, and we'll talk more about that. So let me just start with more the dry part of what is the right of return or the right to return under international law, and I will go quickly through it. Some of you already know this stuff, but it's really important to talk about the foundations of the right to return. It is really rooted in the international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international refugee law. These are three different sources of international law. So when we talk about human rights law, it's the laws, the treaties that were adopted by the United Nations, ratified by many countries, particularly after World War II. In fact, the right of return, or right to return, was really a foundational right as part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we will be celebrating the 70th anniversary this coming December. And around the same time, the Palestinians really became displaced and refugees, as Riham mentioned, 80% of the historic Palestinian indigenous community. So when we talk about the right of return, it really comes from the notion of and the lessons really learned from the horrors of World War II and from the horrors of the Holocaust. That is refugees during that period of time were really in need of not only safe haven, but also a call for protection and repatriation, return to their homes and lands. So from that perspective, the humanity, the global community came together and said, as part of the understanding of how do we protect humanity, the right to return should be a fundamental right, an inherent right that every human being should have the right. And specifically in Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and return to his country. So that's the kind of first foundation. And then this right to return was developed under another important treaty that is called International Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which was adopted in 1966. Many countries, including the United States, including Israel, ratified those treaties. Israel, for example, ratified it in 1991. The United States ratified it only in 1992. But in this treaty, we have another affirmation of the right to return. And it's clear in Article 12.4 that says no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of the right to enter his own country. And now here, what's important about this is that there are no restrictions that could be placed on this right. No restrictions in the name of national security, public order, or safety. These are some of the restrictions or some of the excuses or justifications that countries sometimes use or invoke in order to restrict rights. And they are actually sometimes in the treaties. But in this particular provision, when it comes to the return to your home country, there's no restriction. The only restriction is that it could be suspended during a time of emergency. That is, in a time of war, you may not be able to uphold the right of a person to return, so you can suspend that. But that has to be done within very strict circumstances. For example, the emergency situation should amount to a threat to the existence of the nation. Not just any kind of threat. It's not like a passing storm that will make you keep leave away or keep out people from returning, refugees. In Israel, for example, asserted that it's in an emergency situation since 1948 to this day, and every year the Knesset has to renew the state of emergency, which allows the government to use all kinds of emergency situations, which you over here, for example, hear about this only when a time of catastrophes and hurricanes, stuff like that. But in Israel, it is a permanent state of emergency, which in a legal sense, again, from the perspective of Israeli legal point of view, allows them to take measures that would, for example, restrict and prevent people from returning to their home countries. Now, the right to return from an Israeli perspective has always been seen as a major way of preventing Palestinians, not just from returning to their homes, but from their ability to be able to take back their properties, to be back to their communities. As Riham mentioned, over 450 towns and villages were destroyed. We'll talk more about some of those horrific details. But the most important thing to remember is that when it comes to the right of return, it is not just like some sort of an abstract issue. It's for people. It's like a whole living experience. It's that you are basically rooted out of your community, and you are told because of your being a Palestinian, whether you're Palestinian Christian or Palestinian Muslim in this case, you are not allowed to return back. While in the case of Israeli Jews, even if you have no connection to the place, if you lived in Moldova all your life or your time, you can actually exercise what Israel calls the right under the law of return, to be able to come and become a full Israeli citizen, while Palestinian refugees are denied their very basic right to return home. We're not talking about citizenship, because under international law, there is no right to acquire citizenship. There's a right of return. What happens after that is something that obviously will be part of what countries have obligations to treat everyone equally and so on. And then That from there's a discussion about what should really happen. Maybe we'll have more about that. But the most important thing that happened right after the Nakba was that the international community was very clear that that was a violation of all the rules, of all the customs that were at least understood at the time. And therefore, in 1948, in December of 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations, which is meeting here in New York this year, it passed important resolution 194, which affirmed the right of return with no equivocation, no conditions whatsoever. And it says, and it's really important to quote that resolution, because really it's the foundational resolution for the right of return movement and for all refugees. And it says, in a provision 11 of that resolution, the United Nations General Assembly resolves that the refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return, and for loss of or damage to property which under principles of international law or in equity should be made good by the governments of authorities responsible. So here are the very important notion of affirming the right of return. It should not be diminished by the fact that if you get a compensation, you're not allowed to return. No, it is about affirming both rights. You be restituted and repatriated, and then, or you could choose. And that's actually one of the things that have developed over the years. For example, the High Commissioner for Refugees, which was established also around the same time, given the crisis of refugees in Europe during that time, and the fact that the United Nations was facing this crisis, upheld these rules and these conditions. There are three things that you have to provide to refugees as choices. One is repatriation, and voluntary repatriation is the more preferred and favored one. The second is staying where they are. Some of the refugees, for example, stayed after the war, World War II, moved to a country and they stayed in that country. France, for example, or in Netherlands, or in the UK. They stayed there. If they can stay there, that's fine. The third option is resettlement, something that we talked about a lot here under Trump, where this country now, for example, Trump slashed the number of refugees that can be resettled in the United States to 30,000, which is the lowest number that we've had since we ratified the Refugee Protocol in 1980. So those are the three choices. And those are not diminished. You can choose. The refugee will have to choose. So moving quickly to what does that really mean for the Palestinians. So the Palestinians, very beginning, said, well, we are displaced people. We are people that are, most of our communities are outside our homeland, and we wish to return. Israel closed the borders after 1948, after the ceasefire agreement that was reached in 1949, and basically made it clear that anyone who dares to return, who crosses the border, will be shot at and killed. And between 1947 and 48 till the early 50s, 1950s, there were thousands of Palestinians who were trying to come back from Jordan, from Lebanon, refugee camps, and who tried to sneak in back to their homes and to their communities. Many families were separated. Again, thinking about those family separations that we're all outraged about. This is the kind of thing that happened on a horrific numbers, right? My family, my mother's aunt was separated. She left to Lebanon. She was never able to come back. She died a few years ago in Lebanon. Was never able to return, even though she was living just blocks away from the rest of her family. And so all of that stuff happened while Israel, by force, said, we will not allow any Palestinians to come back. Because we have, and that is in a situation where we know, now historically know, that was after a very planned decision and premeditated decision of the Zionist forces led by the Haganah and Ben-Gurion, who was leading the Haganah, to make sure that we we deport as many Palestinians, we destroy their property, we do not allow them to come back. And in the situations where you find that certain Palestinian communities remained, like for example in Nazareth, if you go back to the history of Nazareth, where my wife comes from, there was a decision to deport them, by force, but at some point there was a disagreement within the Zionist forces, and then there was the consideration, what do we do if we deport this largely Palestinian Christian community? We would have a terrible way of explaining that to the Western world, particularly because Nazareth is one of the three most important cities in the Holy Land, right? So there was a decision that, okay, well, let's just keep the community there, and they reached a ceasefire agreement, and basically the Palestinian community in Nazareth surrendered. There was a ceremony even of surrendering the town with little fighting and little casualties. Although there are some who left and couldn't come back, and all these stories are now and more becoming known as people are speaking, because there is a trauma of the Nakba that is, by the way, continuing, including for not my generation, obviously, so we didn't live the Nakba, but my parents and my grandparents that did not really want to talk about this stuff. So the last thing I want to close with is just quickly is about why the Palestinians in Gaza are staging protests on a weekly basis. And we've seen those images, and this is incredible. They've been doing that since March 30th of this year, every Friday. And yet Israel has been saying, no, you can't even get close to the fence. There's no border, by the way, because Israel has never defined its border. You don't even come close to the fence and we will make sure that you get killed. A policy that was approved by the Israeli Supreme Court. I was with a delegation during the time that the Israeli Supreme Court heard arguments or cases, petitions filed by human rights organizations. And it was shocking to see how the government was defending its policy of why we would use live ammunition as a first choice as soon as somebody gets close to 100 meters close to the fence. And they could not really explain it other than to say that we're going to be, there will be like hundreds and thousands of people who will be coming into the country, and what are we going to do next? What are we going to do? We can't allow them to come in, and then there's all the fear mongering that is parcel of the narrative, that is refugees are coming back home. The same fear mongering that we're hearing here, we're hearing in Europe, and it's been always against refugees. And we have to really understand why is it where we can understand people saying, well, how can they come and take my home? But the question is really, is that what the Palestinians really want to do? And I think most of the Palestinians who are saying we have the right of return, they understand the reality is that it's not saying that we're gonna, push everybody else to the sea as the propaganda goes. So I think we have to really ensure and affirm the human story of the Palestinian refugees first, that they're supported by legal rights. And the fact that the people in Gaza, most of whom are refugees and live literally miles away from their original towns and villages in the south of Israel, can't even get close to where they used to live, or their ancestors, their fathers and mothers and grandparents used to live. And so we have to see why people are protesting, not just because they want to go and get shot, because they have no hope left. In fact, the numbers that came out just yesterday from the World Bank released a very concerning, troubling report. It says 1.8 million people live in Gaza. Every second person in Gaza is now living in poverty. The youth unemployment has come to 70%, right? 50% of the unemployment rate in general, unemployment in youth, 70%. these are the same youth that some of them are going to protest because there's no hope. What are they going to do? 80% of the population lives in, under Unitarian aid. So with that, I think that what we really need to discuss today is what are the ways forward for the rights of Palestinians to be realized in a way that is consistent with decency and humanity, with international law, with a way that will really be possible for all people, and for really ensuring that there will be the right of return is the foundation for a just peace, which is something that I truly believe in. I think that there's so many solutions been tried and failed. There was one thing that was really never tried, is to really recognize and acknowledge first the right of return. There's no recognition whatsoever. In fact, there's a denying of the Nakba. There's a denying of the right of refugees. And in that sense, it makes things worse for reaching a just solution. So it starts with recognition and affirming the right, and then we can talk about practical solution of how to make it work so that all people can enjoy equal rights and dignity.